Hello, my friends. Tonight, I'd like to talk to you a little bit about ships and bridges. As you almost certainly know, a couple of days ago, a container ship up here in the Baltimore harbor ran into one of the supporting piers of the Francis Scott Key Bridge, which is the major artery going north and south up the East Coast. The bridge was built in 1977, and it was built specifically to provide among other things, of course, to provide an alternative route for hazardous materials to come from the north to the south or south to the north. The other two tracks, the other two routes going underneath the Chesapeake Bay are tunnels. And you don't want to run hazardous material into tunnels because if there's an accident, then you have a real big problem, and particularly if it's any kind of an explosion or anything like that, because all the water from the bay up above you goes in and floods the tunnels, and trying to get that one fixed is a big, big problem. And so this bridge, which was built 35 years ago, I guess, was specifically so that you could bring volatile and dangerous materials down. Now, to give you an example of what that means, it means that all of the jet fuel, if you will, that supports Washington and Norfolk and all the major cities going down the East Coast all come across that bridge as they come from the north. And so and you can just multiply it out many times. What the kind of implications are. It's a major, significant kind of artery for the economics of the East Coast of the United States. At the same time, what the bridge did was provide a way in which the large container ships that service the port of Baltimore could go in and out of the bay there. Baltimore is what, the second largest port on the East Coast? I suspect behind maybe Newark or something up that services the New York area. Washington, D.C. is, Baltimore is the place where most of the automobiles coming from Europe come, all your high-priced kind of cars, they come into the States. To say nothing about all kinds of other things. And so, if you will, you've got a major kind of vertical artery with the interstate highway coming down from the north and servicing the north and the south. And from the kind of east and west, you have a major marine transit area that brings huge amounts of material and supplies and products into the country. And so about 1 o'clock in the morning, a couple of days ago, this 1,000-foot long container ship that had about enough containers for something like a 2 or a 3 mile long railroad train. Lots of containers. Weighs a huge amount of money. A lot of weight, And it, if you know anything about that kind of stuff, I know some from being in the Navy, what you know is that the momentum of those ships, they weigh so much that the momentum of them is extraordinarily hard to abate, and that it's really quite easy for something like an aircraft carrier, for instance, who does not that do not have bow and stern thrusters that can give you a thwart ship's kind of vectoring so that you can push it out or push it in. All you can do is go kind of forward or kind of backwards. An aircraft carrier, if you don't nestle it up next to a pier at about an inch a minute or something like that, you literally will take the whole pier out. And if you've ever seen anything, what a pier looks like in naval stations, they're giant, extraordinarily robust construction, and the momentum of these big ships are just so huge that you have to just be very, very, very careful. The way that the cruise industry with passengers gets around this is that they have thrusters that go through the hull, and they can move the ship sideways. And they have bow thrusters and aft thrusters as well, so that I've seen a cruise ship, for instance, stand in one place and just twist itself all around 360 or 180 degrees. And so what that gives is those kind of ships a great deal of agility, and so that they can get in and out of places. And they seldom need tugboats, but the large ships typically need tugboats to get them in and out, because when they're going slow, they don't have enough way on. They're not moving fast enough that they get responses from the rudder. So it's kind of like an airplane that you got to get it going fast enough that you get enough force over the control surfaces that they control. They can make a difference. And so you had this big, massive ship that was in the middle of the night, 1 o'clock in the morning, that was coming out, and it essentially headed straight toward one of the supporting piers, the pylons, the piers that held up this bridge. And it lost power for a minute or two. All the lights went off, and then they came on, and but it had lost enough steerage way that it ran directly into the pier and brought down the bridge. And then all of the handicapping immediately began, and all of the questions kind of got generated about what in the world happened and why did it happen and who did what to when. And initially, when I heard about it, it seemed to me that there'd probably been an electrical failure on the ship, and that's enough to eliminate the controlling capabilities. And so I could see that you could lose the opportunity, the ability to steer the ship and so on, maybe even the engines. But what I've heard lately is that the engines continued to operate, but they lost steerage. But then apparently the power came up again just before they hit the pier. There was a great deal of speculation about what in fact happened. And like I said, at first I thought it was just an accident. But when you back away, this is a little bit like COVID. When they started the whole COVID business, at first you buy into the narrative, and your initial reaction is to say, oh my, this is a problem that we've got to deal with. It's an accident, if you will. And then if you back away from this thing and start to look at it in a large kind of context, it begins to raise serious kind of questions. Well, that's exactly what happened here. It's because as you back away, you start to say to yourself, what does it take for a ship like that to lose all of its power? And what is the likelihood that it would run into that kind of bridge. And what is the kind of implications if that would happen? And you start to kind of stack these things up and you start to say, wait a second, there are too many big deals that are all happening all at once in order to effectively make the case that this was an accident. As a matter of fact, if you think that it's an accident, if you have bought into the narrative of the media as they run around trying to make sense out of this thing, then with all due respect, you don't know what you're talking about. Because this has all of the earmarks of having been a major sabotage, a major hack. And let me explain to you how this works. About 15 years ago, there was a study done, a major study, that evaluated and assessed the possibility that a ship of this kind, a container ship, would run into a pier on the supporting member of a major bridge and bring it down. And it was obvious that if the supporting members of the bridge were not defended in some way, if there wasn't some buttress, some kind of a fender or something that would deflect the ship and run it away from the base of this thing, that it clearly would bring a bridge down. They did a study 10 or 15 years ago on this key bridge, and they came to that very conclusion that something hit this bridge that's to bring the whole thing down. Well, the solution, if you've ever noticed it before, or when you drive across a bridge or you drive and you can look across, maybe if there's two parallel bridges, you can see that the solution is to build a big concrete base around the bottom that looks kind of like a Vesica Pisces. That was a kind of a half moon or a thing that was big, kind of high concrete, very robust. And so if you hit it anyway, other than just absolutely straight on, you'd be pushed off and it would protect and you wouldn't be able to get yourself in and hit the pier. Well, they looked at that on the Key Bridge and decided it was too expensive to retrofit and build that into the Key Bridge. And so in the Key Bridge, it was this direct shot straight into the bridge, into the pier, which means it was undefended. What also is clear, and they again did an assessment and a study 10 or 15 years ago, and they found out and made the case that these kinds of ships, the new kind of technology had come into place where they were monitoring these ships from satellites in order so they could know the owners and others, Coast Guard and such, could know exactly where they were and so on. And what that did was allow the potential hacking of the complete electrical system of the ship, because you could come in through through a satellite or through the sky or through some kind of a signal from an external source. And if you knew what you were doing, you could hack the electronics and you could get yourself, and once you opened it up, you can get anywhere in the ship that you wanted, including all the control systems. Now, that turns out to be the case with automobiles. If you think that you drive your car, in a sense, you really don't. You have no direct control of your car. A modern automobile has something like 1,500 microprocessors in it, and there is no direct control connection between the steering wheel or the brakes, for that matter, and the wheels, the front wheels, or the brakes, your brake pedal, and so on. It's all mediated. It's all controlled through electronics. It's compounded by the fact that you now have all these OneStar and other kinds of services that are connected to an antenna on the top of the car, and they communicate in real time, terms exactly where the car is, where it's going, how fast it's going, and by the way, what the sounds from inside, that is to say, the voices and the conversations inside the car are. And so it's been clearly demonstrated that if you've got the right kind of gear and know what you're doing, you can drive up behind any one of these kinds of cars, and that you can hack the system and take over the steering and the braking and such, and accelerate the car and drive it into a tree or something, like they did to a reporter who was one day away from releasing a major story on the National Security Agency that certainly would have been embarrassing to the NSA. And so they did this study, 10 or 15 years ago, and established, that one of the security issues, I guess I should say, relative to all of this, is that you could relatively easily take control of a large ship like this. So now you've got the capabilities, right? You've got the capabilities to hack into the system of the ship, and you could drive it kind of where you wanted to. I don't know for how long before somebody figured out, or how you could stop it, or whatever it is, but at least you could take control of the ship for a goodly period of time. And you say, but what about the power going off? What was that about? Well, the Russians have demonstrated rather impressively that they can fly an airplane over the top of a major American warship and turn off all the electricity in the ship until they fly away and get on the other side, and then they can turn all the electricity on. That demonstration in the Black Sea a number of years ago precipitated the emergency recall of all of the aircraft carriers in the U.S. fleet to come back in and get retrofitted in some kind of way in which they could defend themselves against this. And so clearly there are some advanced electronic warfare capabilities that the Russians have, and one presumes the United States and Chinese and others do as well, that can, from a distance, shut down all of the electric and electronics on, whatever the target is at some distance away. So knowing that, now you've got two ways in which you could hack a ship. You could do it from some cabin cruiser that was driving innocuously, innocently down the bay at the same time the ship was doing it. Or you could do it from a satellite, or you could get into the system any of a number of ways. So you've got possibility, you've got capability. The basic way in which you assess threats in the military, at least, is that you have to have capability and intention. It doesn't make any difference if you got all the intention in the world if you don't have the capability. And by the way, if you have capability out the gazoo and you don't, like our allies, like the French or the Brits, they've got all kinds of nuclear weapons and stuff, but they're not a threat to us because they don't have intent. And so what you need is capability and intent. And in this particular case, we've now established capability. Now the other side of the equation is intent. And you would say to yourself, why in the world would anybody want to do this to a bridge in Chesapeake Bay? Well, it's not very hard to kind of put that one together. It was only a week before that there was this, quote, terrorist attack on a coliseum or a major kind of gathering place in Moscow. And it killed, 150 people or something like that. And it's a major kind of problem, major issue, major event. What has happened is essentially that, however you kind of think about it, it appears that you've now carried this Ukrainian war business into the middle of Russia in a major way. Now, let me speculate and report and repeat what reports are, and they come out of the people who are reporting things from out of the intelligence community and any number of other kind of places that are authoritative. What they say is this: that there's no way that you could have pulled off a thing like that in Moscow. That the United States and Britain and Ukraine were not behind it. They tried to lay it off on ISIS, right? Within an hour, they were saying it's ISIS, ISIS. Well, you just have to remember that Barack Obama was the founder of ISIS. Literally, they put the money together and put the organization together. So they still have, by that, I mean, he didn't personally do it, but he approved the process and the funding of ISIS. And so the United States continues, of course, to continue to have relationships there. And so it's a kind of timely and appropriate, useful cutout for the major powers to be able to use this organization or say that they're using this organization for whatever they're trying to do. Problem with that is that the guys who did it were on their way back to Ukraine to trying to get back, and the security forces in Russia captured them in a car going on the way back to Ukraine. And so it clearly was this I don't know, a Hail Mary kind of thing, because the Ukrainians are really about out of time and out of money and out of ideas and out of people, by the way. They've now lost something over 400,000 troops killed in this whole thing, and they're running around town in Kiev and other places, grabbing men off of the road, off the street, literally grabbing them, hauling them into cars and pressing them like press gangs in the old British Navy and other places, and sending them out to the front, sometimes with about 2 or 3 weeks worth of training, and they just become cannon fodder. But anyways, they're running out of it and they're losing the war, and they're going to try everything they can. And it's not just them. The United States and the West, France is very vocal about this. Certainly there's the Brits, that they will not let the Russians win this war. So they're going to do everything in the world that they can to keep this thing from being a complete disaster. They're trying to start World War III, therefore. I mean, that's what's behind all of this. And the writing is kind of on the wall that within the next couple of months, if they will do everything they can to try to do that. But it wouldn't have taken the Russian intelligence services and very long at all to ascertain that the Americans and the Brits and the Ukrainians were behind this attack on Moscow. That's a big red line that they crossed, a huge kind of red line, and it potentially was a major turning point in this whole conflict, because when you start to get inside of Russia, and they've made it very clear that if you attack Russian for a long time, repeatedly, if you attack Russia, Crimea, whatever, that they would not hesitate to respond. And so you could say to yourself, well, they responded. They decided that in response to that attack in Russia, they were going to bring the war to the United States. Now, how would you do something like that? How would you pick some bridge in Baltimore, for instance? I mean, wouldn't New York be a better idea, or any of a number of places? Let me tell you something, and this again goes to the naivete of a lot of people who handicap this thing and say, "Oh, it was just a mistake that this ship just lost power and ran into the bridge." The major powers in this world have significant capabilities to do systems analysis, advanced systems analysis. And they do this around potential targets. I'm aware of two of these kind of targeting kind of functions within the United States. There may be a whole lot more, but there's one for nuclear targeting. It's used to be run out of Omaha, Nebraska, off at Air Force Base, and they did all the nuclear targeting to figure out where in Russia and China or wherever you wanted to drop these kinds of bombs and where you'd send them from and all these kinds of things. And they had a lot of people spend a whole lot of time trying to figure out, do all the analysis of how much damage and how many people would die and whatever, and how it would affect the economics and so on. The other side of this thing are these commands that do strategic kind of systems analysis, and specifically about trying to understand where the vulnerabilities are within complex systems, countries that are presumed to be enemies of the United States, or adversaries at least. And these systems analytical groups, one in particular that I have visited, are substantial outfits. I don't remember exactly how many. 350 people stick in my mind, but they have this is all built upon computer analysis and being able to do systems analysis of any given kind of system, like a psychological system or a social system or an economic system or an energy system or a communication system, and to be able to identify where the most vulnerable place in the system is, so that if you needed to, that you could bring munitions in right on that place and be confident that you'd bring that whole thing down. I used to give talks alluding to this kind of thing, talking about the fact that there was going to be the ability to, for instance, on a bridge, I used to talk about a bridge, they'd be able to do the analysis, the structural aspects of a bridge and the materials analysis of what the kind of the rivets and the side and what the bridge is made out of, to be able to identify maybe 1 square meter of where if you hit that, that's the most vulnerable place in the bridge, and the whole thing will come down. That was 25 years ago. And if you consider going forward the extraordinary advances that have taken place in terms of computer capability and computing capability, and take into consideration that if they had that kind of stuff going that long ago, what would they have now? They would have the ability to try to evaluate the social fabric of a country, of a group and be able to say where's the kind of weak spot in this thing that we should concentrate all of our efforts. These ideas are not new. They were generated in the Second World War by, or it might have even been in the First World War, by a German military analyst, and the term that they came up with was Schwerpunkt. And it's the whole idea was, where's the weak place in the line that you can concentrate all your efforts on and therefore break through into the enemy territory? Well, this basic concept has been raised to a much higher and more sophisticated scale. And although I certainly don't know anything for certain, I would bet a great deal of money that the Russians and any number of other kind of groups, probably, you need to be pretty good size and pretty substantial in order to kind of support this kind of thinking and these kinds of capabilities. But the Russians for sure, Chinese for sure, have done this analysis of, say, the East Coast of the United States to know with great deal and specificity just where they wanted to, where they could put a bit of force in play, and how they could you could multiply that many times over in terms of its implications. And so it would have been quite simple to determine that this interstate highway across this bridge was this central artery in terms of the whole eastern part of the United States. And it was undefended because they had decided it was too much money 10 or 15 years ago, and so they wouldn't put these buttresses around it to fend off a ship. You know, I've never been in that space directly, but I've been around it and heard a little bit about it. And what I know is that if you've got a whole lot of people and a whole lot of money, and all your job is to do is to try to figure out ways to screw with the other guy, they come up with some very creative kind of ways. And if you add to that this ability to do really advanced systems analysis, to say that's the place where you got to touch it, and if you touch it right there, the whole thing comes down. It isn't very hard to then start to spend your time and say, well, how do I touch it the right way? And that was what really seems to happen. Now, the implications of all of this, and by the way, the reports are from people who are getting them out of the intelligence community, is that they all understand that that's exactly what happened. People are not naming names, but they're being very explicit on making the case and communicating the fact that we know what happened, and they did it to us. So what did they do to us? Well, the last assessment are that it directly impacted the life. It will directly impact the lives of 140,000 people. There are 8,000 people who have direct jobs just in the harbor, at the docks and so on in Baltimore. But when you start to then work yourself out in these concentric circles of influence, what you rapidly find out that this is a really, really big deal. It's a really big deal in terms of its psychological impact on humans. Some people are saying that it is the equivalent of Pearl Harbor. And so if you think about that for a minute, you say, how many people were how many Americans were directly impacted by what happened in Pearl Harbor. You'd have a hard time finding 140,000 people that were directly impacted by that. I mean, psychologically, people think about it, and react to the thing, but directly impacted. This is a really big deal. This is going to affect the ability of hundreds of thousands of people to be able to support their families and other kinds of things like that. They estimate that for what it's worth, it's probably, I don't know, 9 months. It could be 9 months for them just to clear the harbor or the seaway so that they can get ships in and out again, to just be able to continue trade out of that kind of place. And now they're estimating it'll be 4 or 5 years at least before they can rebuild the bridge. By the way, when the bridge is out, then as I mentioned, you've got no way in which to get all of these flammable and corrosive kinds of material around that to find all these giant circuitous ways to go way out in the countryside and so on in order to get around Baltimore, because there's no way to go through the middle of Baltimore anymore. This event could very well be the most significant event, turn out to be the most significant event that's happened in our lives. The impact of this in two terms, because first of all, it, as I've suggested, has huge kind of economic and personal kind of implications, just directly related to this. It's going to cut off supply chains and increase costs and all other kinds of things, and to say nothing about the inability for people to drive on a road to get to work and that kind of stuff. And so it's got a huge kind of impact in that regard. Some analysts are suggesting, interestingly enough, is that what it is going to do is divide the country between the North and the South, because what it cut out is this major artery that sustains the economic and, other kind of flow between the North and South. It's the it's a reestablishment of the Mason-Dixon line between the North and South in the Civil War. What it may well do, and it'd be pretty easy to bet on this and win money, is that these neocons in the government, in our government, will rise to the occasion and decide that they can't do that to us. We'll show them. And they will then decide they're going to do something even bigger to the Russians to show them just who's the boss and so on. That's not a good idea. And what the world needs now is some kind of thoughtful assessment of all of this, rather than these kind of puffing yourself up trying to decide who's the meanest guy on the block. There is a whole, I've alluded to this in the past, there's a whole set of military capabilities that almost nobody knows about, that they're starting to realize, because they're starting to question what's happening in Lahaina and California and up in Quebec and so on, these fires that are all starting up. And so there's lots of folks who are saying, they're directed energy weapons, and they come from somewhere in the sky, whether they're from aircraft or from satellites. And until that started happening, very few people knew anything or even thought about that the principal way that you might fight a future war would be from electronic beams out of, from out of satellites in the sky. But that's just kind of the tip of the iceberg, because there are this whole set of capabilities which are called scalar weapons, and and then the Russians and the Israelis and the Americans and the Chinese and South Africans and Brazilians reportedly have these kinds of capabilities, and they operate in almost another dimension. They're not conventional in any kind of way. They have the ability to collect and contain a huge amount of energy. They call it a bottle of energy, and they can essentially transmit that bottle of energy to any other place on the planet almost instantaneously. And what you get is if you choose to use it that way, you get an explosion, and the explosion comes from nowhere, and there leaves no signature at all, and it looks like a small nuclear weapon. We seem to have tried that on the Chinese, if you remember, about 8 or 9 years ago, and blew up a chemical plant in a harbor, in one of the Chinese harbors, and it just came out of the blue and just blew the place up, and nobody could figure out what happened. Well, these guys all they poke each other to try to see what kind of response they get. They poke each other to show others what they can do. That's what the Russians did when they overflew this frigate in the Black Sea and shut off all of its electronics, all the electricity on the ship. They were showing them, saying, see what we can do. The other applications of the scalar stuff is that they can change the characteristics, the physical characteristics of a given defined amount of volume of anywhere. So they know if they know where it is, and there are ways to do that, they could shut off all the electricity in a submarine under the ocean, and it would never come up. They could do the same thing as they did, presumably using other technologies, with this frigate in the Black Sea. They can do it to human beings. They can target individual humans, and this technology will follow the human and find the human wherever they are, find the signature. It's tuned up, described in what you could generally kind of call a very complex computer program that would describe all the characteristics of who that human was and so on, the uniqueness, perhaps something about DNA, I don't know. But in any case, regardless of where they went, they will always be targeted, and you could punch a button and boom, you take that individual out. In some versions of it, you can more benign versions, so you can change the way people think. You can do broad scale influence of groups, social groups, large groups of people. Anyway, it gets very weird really quite fast, and it's really non-standard and very unconventional. And so if in fact that the neocons in this country decide that they are going to raise the ante on this little card game, what they risk in huge ways is this moving into a level where the retaliation and the reaction between the two forces would be very, very large and impactful. I mean, the Russians have made it very clear that they've got submarines parked off the east coast of the United States with big nuclear torpedoes, and they turn them on and they'll do a tidal wave that'll take out every major city on the East Coast. I mean, and why in the freaking world do you want to play in that kind of space? And so there's a message here that the Russians, one presumes almost certainly, have tried to send, and that is that don't mess around here. Don't run this thing up, because we, in one kind of 3-minute event, we can take out a great deal of the economy of the whole East Coast of the United States. So if you then back away a little bit and you say, okay, so what are the guys with the big pictures are saying? What are the Cliff Highs and Norton Armstrong saying about where we're going in the next couple of months? They all got their hands in the air saying, here it comes. This is going to be, Cliff High says the 8th of April is a big date. Martin Armstrong says the 8th or 9th of May is a big date. And so you really don't know what's coming. And then you layer into that, all the stuff they're doing, trying to do with Trump. I mean, there's no way that you don't get a fight out of the back end of whatever happens to Trump. If they assassinate him, somebody goes crazy. If he gets reelected, another whole bunch of people all go crazy. If they throw him in jail, you get a whole bunch of people going crazy. So you've got yourself into a very interestingly volatile kind of period of time. Having said that, the most knowledgeable people about what literally is going on are all, in an interesting way, very kind of upbeat about what comes out of the back end of all this. Getting from here to there is one thing, but after you make our way through this extraordinary period, then things start to turn, and they turn quickly. That is certainly the evaluation and the assessment that these people have at this point. There are all kinds of wild cards in this kind of scenario. Things that never happened before. Somebody hasn't thought, aliens, space aliens, and solar flares, and who knows what. To say nothing about scalar weapons. But it's going to be a very, very kind of interesting, memorable, historic time in the coming months, it appears, as humans try to figure out how to kind of extract themselves out of this extraordinary kind of mindset that they have that suggests that they need to kill a whole bunch of people because they don't like them or because they won't do what they want them to do. So it'll be fun. I mean, it'll be fun in a kind of an intellectually interesting way to see how this all plays out and where it all goes. I mean, of course, it's an argument for getting our act together to start to build a new world, and we're working on that in any of a number of ways. So we'll be back and we'll talk more about that later. Take care.